The crystal chandeliers of Aurelio's cast fractured light across tables draped in cream linen, each one positioned with the mathematical precision that came from 3 generations of family ownership. Manhattan's financial district emptied itself into this restaurant every Thursday evening. Men in bespoke suits discussing mergers over 30-year scotch, while their assistants made reservations for next week's identical conversations. She moved between tables with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned that being forgotten was safer than being remembered. The black dress hung perfectly on her frame now, after 6 months of regular meals and sleep that wasn't interrupted by fear. Her name tag read Maya, though the owner still sometimes called her the girl from Detroit, despite her insistence that she'd never lived anywhere near Michigan. The dining room hummed with the particular energy of Thursday night, that sweet spot between midweek exhaustion and weekend anticipation, when inhibitions loosened and credit cards emerged, without the guilt that accompanied Monday expenses. She refilled water glasses that were still 3/4 full, straightened silverware that didn't need straightening, her hands busy with the choreography of service that kept her present but unremarkable. The corner table had been occupied for 2 hours by a man whose presence seemed to alter the atmospheric pressure of the room. He wore charcoal gray that probably cost more than her monthly rent, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. The document spread before him remained untouched while his phone sat dark and silent, an unusual restraint in a room full of people who treated their devices like life support systems. She had learned to read danger the way some people read sheet music, a survival skill inherited from 23 years of measuring threats before they fully materialized. This man radiated control, the kind that didn't announce itself with volume or aggressive posturing. When she'd poured his wine 90 minutes ago, his thank you had been so quiet she'd almost missed it. His eyes had met hers for exactly 2 seconds, and something in that brief contact had felt like recognition, though they'd never met before tonight. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The entrance door opened without its usual gentle chime, the electronic bell mysteriously silent as 4 men entered wearing suits that didn't quite match the restaurant's old money atmosphere. Their shoes were wrong for the polished marble floors, too heavy and practical. Their watches caught the light with the aggressive flash of people who'd recently acquired wealth and wanted everyone to know it. The maitre d' moved to intercept them with the practiced diplomacy that came from 30 years of managing difficult situations, but the lead man simply walked past as if velvet ropes and reservation books didn't apply to his particular reality. They didn't wait to be seated, instead positioning themselves throughout the dining room with the deliberate spacing of chess pieces claiming strategic squares. 2 flanked the entrance to the private dining area, where the restaurant's most exclusive clients conducted business behind frosted glass. 1 positioned himself near the bar where he could observe the entire main floor. The 4th remained by the host stand, his back to the street entrance, his attention focused inward on the dining room like a shepherd counting sheep. The remaining patrons sensed the shift immediately, conversations faltering mid-sentence as instinct registered what conscious minds hadn't yet processed. An elderly couple at table 8 quietly requested their check, their anniversary celebration abandoned in favor of retreat. The group of young attorneys who'd been celebrating a successful arbitration began gathering their belongings with the careful casualness of people who understood that sometimes discretion was the better part of survival. Within minutes, the exodus began with the smooth efficiency that came from Manhattan money, knowing exactly when to exit stage left. Maya watched from the service station as the room emptied, her hands continuing their mechanical work of polishing wine glasses that didn't need polishing. The owner disappeared into his office without explanation, the door clicking shut with unusual finality. The sommelier found sudden urgent business in the wine cellar. Even the busboy who usually lingered for overtime vanished through the kitchen exit into the night. She stood alone in the dining room now, except for the man in the corner and the four who'd come for him. The air felt compressed, thick, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks and transforms ordinary afternoon into something biblical. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the wineglass she was polishing. The man at the corner table hadn't moved, his posture unchanged, as if he hadn't registered the invasion of his space or the systematic clearing of witnesses. But Maya saw the subtle shift in his jaw, the way his right hand had dropped below the table's edge. He knew exactly what was happening, was calculating odds and angles with the cold precision of someone who'd survived similar situations through careful assessment rather than panic. She picked up a bottle of wine from the service station, a 2015 Barolo that cost $600 and was rarely ordered except by people who understood what they were drinking. Her feet carried her toward the corner table while her mind screamed at her to run, to follow the busboy's example and disappear into the anonymous safety of Manhattan's evening crowds. Every survival instinct she'd ever developed told her to be anywhere but here, to let whatever was about to happen unfold without her involvement or witness. But she'd seen something when the four men entered, a detail that her mind had catalogued even as her body moved through the routines of service. The lead man had adjusted his jacket as he positioned himself by the host stand, and for just a fraction of a second, she'd seen the outline beneath the fabric. Not a gun, which would have been almost conventional in its threat. No, she'd seen the distinctive shape of a remote detonator, the kind her ex-boyfriend had shown her once during one of his late-night bragging sessions about jobs his crew had pulled. The kind that triggered devices from a safe distance, allowing the operator to watch the results without risk of being caught in the blast radius. Her mind raced through possibilities with the speed that came from years of anticipating danger. If they had a detonator, they had a device. If they had a device, it was already in position. And if they'd taken the time to clear the room systematically, they wanted this man specifically, wanted him dead in a way that looked like random violence rather than targeted assassination. She reached the corner table and lifted the wine bottle, her hand perfectly steady now despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The man looked up at her with those dark eyes, a question forming in his expression. She leaned forward to pour, her body angling to partially block the view from the four men watching. Her lips barely moved as she whispered the words that would either save his life or end hers. "If you stand, they'll shoot." The wine poured in a steady stream, the sound covering her voice. She didn't look at him, didn't let her expression change from the professional courtesy expected of servers in establishments that charged $30 for a side of asparagus. His entire body went rigid, but he didn't move otherwise, understanding flooding his features as his eyes flicked downward, then toward the four men, then back to her face. She saw him processing the information, calculating whether to trust a stranger's whispered warning or his own assessment of the situation. The wineglass filled to exactly the proper level, and she straightened, turning away with the bottle cradled against her chest like armor. Her legs felt like water as she walked to the next table, an empty foretop that didn't need service but provided reason for her continued presence in the danger zone. She set down fresh napkins with hands that only trembled when no one was watching. The lead man's eyes tracked her movement but found nothing suspicious in a waitress performing her duties during what appeared to be a normal, if unusually quiet, evening service. His hand remained near his jacket pocket, fingers resting on the concealed detonator with the patience of someone waiting for the precise right moment. The man in the corner remained frozen, his breathing shallow and controlled. He understood sniper protocols, understood that any sudden movement could be interpreted as threat or flight, either of which would trigger the response these men had positioned themselves to deliver. His mind was probably racing through scenarios, mapping the room for cover that didn't exist, calculating angles and distances with the tactical awareness of someone who'd spent years staying alive through careful observation. Maya moved to table 6 and began clearing dessert plates that had been abandoned in the exodus, the sound of porcelain clinking filling the terrible silence with ordinary noise that felt obscene, given what was unfolding. Her peripheral vision caught one of the 4 men checking his watch with growing impatience, his body language shifting from patient waiting to frustrated anticipation. They'd expected the target to stand by now, to react to their presence with either confrontation or retreat. Instead, he sat perfectly still, a statue carved from expensive suit and calculated composure. The trap required movement to spring, and he'd given them nothing to work with. The man by the bar shifted his weight, his hand moving to his ear. He was wearing a communications device, receiving instructions from somewhere outside. Maya recognized the gesture from her ex's crew, the way they'd coordinate during jobs she'd pretended not to notice while mentally cataloging every detail in case that information ever became currency for her survival. She carried her tray of dishes toward the kitchen, passing close enough to the bar to hear the man breathing heavily through his nose, the sound of someone whose patience was wearing thin. These weren't professionals accustomed to waiting, to the slow patience of successful operations. They were muscle, hired for a specific job that should have been finished 5 minutes ago. The kitchen doors swung open under her shoulder, and she set the tray down with exaggerated care, buying time while her mind raced through possibilities. Through the circular window, she could see the corner table, see him sitting with supernatural stillness, his wine untouched, his hands now both visible on the table in a gesture of non-aggression that might buy him minutes but wouldn't save his life. The chef had left through the back exit, the ovens cooling in neat rows like soldiers standing down from battle readiness. She was truly alone now with 5 men, and whatever violence was building toward inevitable release. Her phone sat in her locker upstairs. Useless. The landline in the owner's office might as well have been on the moon. She pushed back through the doors, carrying nothing, just a waitress checking on her final table before the restaurant closed for the night. The lead man's eyes narrowed as she approached the corner table again, predator sensing when prey behaves in unexpected patterns. "Can I get you anything else?" Her voice came out perfectly level, years of swallowing fear now disguised as customer service excellence. "Perhaps something from the kitchen before we close." The man in the corner looked at her with something between gratitude and wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was still standing in what was clearly a blast radius. His response came carefully measured, each word selected for meaning beyond its surface. "No, thank you. I'm waiting for someone." The lie hung in the air between them, a fiction they both understood. He was waiting for rescue that wasn't coming, for backup that had probably been systematically neutralized before these 4 men ever entered the restaurant. The careful clearing of the dining room suggested planning that extended beyond tonight, preparation that had mapped every variable including his usual security protocols. "They should be here soon," Maya said, maintaining the fiction while her eyes communicated what her words couldn't. She glanced toward the entrance, then back to him, a message that he needed to break the stalemate before patience ran out, and the men decided that partial success was better than perfect execution. His slight nod acknowledged understanding. The trap was tightening with each passing second, invisible walls closing in while he sat immobile by necessity rather than choice. His business partners, if that's who he'd been expecting, would either walk through those doors into an ambush or wouldn't come at all, having received warnings or threats that kept them away. Maya turned to survey the dining room with the critical eye of someone preparing to close for the evening, her gaze passing over the 4 men with the disinterest appropriate to security personnel or bodyguards who'd accompanied a nervous client. Nothing in her body language suggested she'd identified them as threats or understood their purpose. The lead man seemed to relax fractionally, reassured by her apparent obliviousness. His hand moved away from his jacket pocket, settling instead on the host stand counter with the casual posture of someone who had time to wait. That small shift told Maya everything she needed to know about their timeline. They weren't in a rush, which meant they'd planned for patience, had established a window of opportunity that extended beyond these immediate minutes. The front door opened, and Maya felt her heart leap before crashing back down. It wasn't police or backup. Instead, two men in private security uniforms entered, their faces unfamiliar, but their bearing professional. They weren't restaurant security. Aurelio's had never employed armed guards, which meant they were either part of the conspiracy or responding to something she didn't yet understand. They took in the scene with the quick assessment of people trained to read tactical situations, their hands moving to weapons worn openly on their belts in the way that suggested proper licensing and legitimate authority. The four men tensed, their formation breaking slightly as they recalculated odds that had suddenly shifted. The lead man's hand moved back toward his jacket, toward the detonator that would trigger whatever device they'd planted. But the security guards had already focused on him, their attention drawn by his movement and the guilty calculation visible in his posture. "Gentlemen," the lead security guard's voice carried authority that came from military training and years of managing volatile situations. "The restaurant is closing for the evening. You'll need to conduct your business elsewhere." His partner had already moved to flank them, cutting off easy access to the exit while maintaining enough distance that sudden violence would require crossing open space under observation. The mathematics of the situation shifted in those seconds. 5 men with a remote detonator versus 2 armed guards in a public space that would soon have police responding to any gunfire. The lead man's jaw worked as he weighed options, his hand still hovering near his jacket. Then he nodded once, sharp and final. The gesture of someone who recognized when a job had failed and retreat was the only viable option. The 4 men moved toward the exit with coordinated precision, their formation reforming around their leader as they prepared to abandon the mission. They didn't hurry, but they didn't linger. Professionals who knew when to cut losses and regroup for another attempt on another day. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the quiet dining room. The security guards remained alert, one moving to the window to watch the street, while his partner kept attention divided between the exit and the man at the corner table. "Don't move yet," the lead guard said quietly, his eyes still on the door. "Give it 5 minutes. They might be watching to see if you panic or call for help." The man in the corner nodded fractionally, his body still locked in place despite the immediate threat having departed. Maya stood frozen by table 6, reality crashing over her like cold water. Her knees wanted to buckle, but she forced herself to remain upright, to maintain the composure that had carried her through the last 10 minutes. Minutes crawled past, measured in heartbeats and shallow breaths that seemed too loud in the silence. The security guard at the window finally stepped back, speaking quietly into his radio. "Clear. Vehicle departed south on Water Street. 3 occupants visible, possible 4th in rear seat." Only then did the tension in the room begin to fracture like ice under pressure. "There may be a device," the lead guard said, moving closer but maintaining distance from the corner table. "We'll need to sweep the area before you can move safely. Miss, you should evacuate now." His eyes found Maya with professional concern, already dismissing her as civilian collateral who'd been caught in something beyond her pay grade. She didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she looked at the man in the corner table, really looked at him for the first time since whispering her warning. Face had gone pale beneath expensive grooming, a fine tremor running through his shoulders now that adrenaline had nowhere to go. His dark eyes met hers with intensity that made her breath catch, recognition passing between them that transcended the normal boundaries between strangers who'd shared space and nothing more. "How did you know?" His question cut through the silence, directed at her with focus that demanded truth. "How did you know what they'd planned?" The security guards turned to look at her with new interest, pieces clicking into place as they reassessed her role in whatever had just unfolded. She could lie, should lie, make up some story about seeing suspicious behavior or having a bad feeling. Instead, she told the truth, because he'd trusted her whisper in a moment when trust meant the difference between life and death. "I recognized the detonator," she said quietly, the admission revealing more than she intended about her past and the experiences that had taught her to identify weapons most people wouldn't notice. "My ex-boyfriend worked for people who used remote triggers. I saw it when the lead man adjusted his jacket." The words hung in the air like smoke, transforming her from innocent bystander to something more complicated. Someone with knowledge that suggested proximity to criminal operations, even if that proximity had been unwilling and ultimately escaped. The security guards exchanged glances, their assessment of her shifting from witness to potential intelligence asset. The man in the corner studied her with dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything: her careful posture, her controlled breathing, the way she stood ready to bolt despite having chosen to stay. "What's your name?" His voice had softened but lost none of its intensity, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning beyond simple inquiry. She realized he'd sat in her section for 2 hours without ever asking, accepting her service as if she were part of the furniture, invisible by design and necessity. Now she was visible in a way that made her skin prickle with awareness of danger that didn't come from remote detonators or hired muscle. Maya. The lie came automatically, the name on her tag that wasn't actually hers, borrowed from a friend who'd left New York without looking back. She'd been using it for 6 months, building a new identity around the fiction that she'd always been Maya Chen, reliable server at Aurelio's, student at community college, nobody worth noticing or remembering. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the exact second he recognized the lie. His lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile, acknowledgement passing between them like a shared secret. "Thank you, Maya." The way he said it made the false name sound like a gift he was choosing to accept, rather than a deception he was choosing to challenge. Sirens approached in the distance, multiple vehicles converging on the restaurant with the urgency that suggested someone had called for emergency response. The security guard moved to unlock the front door, preparing for the arrival of police and bomb technicians who would transform the elegant dining room into a crime scene. Soon, the space would flood with questions and protocols, official channels that would grind through the night cataloging evidence and taking statements. Maya's name, her false name, would go into reports that might be cross-referenced with databases she desperately needed to avoid. "You should go." The man in the corner said it quietly, his eyes locked on hers with understanding that transcended what she'd explicitly revealed. "Before they start taking statements, before your name goes in official reports, before questions get asked that you'd rather not answer." He understood what she hadn't said, reading between lines that most people never noticed existed. She'd saved his life by staying when she should have run, but now he was releasing her from the consequences of that choice, giving her permission to disappear back into the careful invisibility she'd worked so hard to maintain. She hesitated, torn between survival instinct and something she couldn't name. He'd sat perfectly still on her word alone, trusted a stranger's whisper over his own assessment of danger. That kind of faith deserved something more than her disappearing into the night like smoke. "The lead man," she said quickly, words tumbling out before courage failed. He checked his watch 3 times in the first 2 minutes. They're working on a timeline, probably coordinated with something else. This wasn't just about you. Information from observation, the only currency she had to offer beyond the warning that had already saved his life. His expression sharpened, intelligence processing her words with visible speed, filing away details that might mean the difference between surviving the next attempt and becoming a statistic. He nodded once, acknowledgement of the gift she'd given him. The sirens were close now, blue lights beginning to strobe through the front windows. She'd run out of time for decisions. Maya moved toward the kitchen, abandoning her section and her tips and the black apron that had been her uniform for 6 months of careful anonymity. The back exit opened to an alley that smelled like garbage and old rain, familiar territory for someone used to leaving through rear doors when staying became more dangerous than fleeing. Behind her, she heard voices flooding into the dining room, authority taking control of crime scene and witness. She didn't look back, couldn't afford the luxury of regret or curiosity about what would happen next. The night swallowed her whole as she joined the river of people flowing through Manhattan's streets. One more anonymous figure in a city that specialized in helping people disappear. Maya's apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better decades, the kind of place where neighbors minded their business and landlords cashed checks without asking questions. She climbed the stairs with legs that still trembled, her keys gripped so tight they left marks in her palm. Inside, she didn't turn on the lights. The street lamp outside her window provided enough illumination to navigate the studio's sparse furniture. Secondhand table, futon that doubled as couch and bed, two chairs that didn't match. She dropped her purse on the table and moved to the window, looking down at the empty street below. Her hands shook as she untied the apron she'd somehow carried home, the black fabric still smelling like wine and fear, and the particular scent of Aurelio's kitchen. The name tag caught the orange glow from outside. Maya stamped in white letters that belonged to someone else's life. She unpinned it with fumbling fingers and dropped it in the kitchen drawer where it landed among takeout menus and batteries that might be dead. The man's face kept appearing behind her closed eyelids. That moment of understanding when he'd realized what she was telling him, the way his entire body had locked into stillness, despite every instinct probably screaming at him to move. She'd saved someone tonight. Pulled a stranger back from the edge of a grave he hadn't known was open. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but instead left her hollow, scraped clean by adrenaline's retreat. Her phone buzzed from inside her purse, the vibration loud in the silent apartment. She ignored it, knowing it would be the owner of Aurelio's demanding explanations for her disappearance, wanting to know why she'd abandoned her shift during what would be described as an incident in whatever carefully worded statement his lawyers crafted. The phone buzzed again, then twice more in quick succession before falling silent. She'd need a new job by the end of the week, new references that couldn't be checked too carefully, another borrowed identity to slip into like ill-fitting clothes. The thought exhausted her more than the terror had. This endless cycle of running that never quite qualified as starting over. Manhattan was supposed to have been different, far enough from Chicago to matter, expensive enough that the people she was running from wouldn't think to look for her among the bankers and lawyers who populated its streets. Her ex-boyfriend's face replaced the strangers in her mind. Derek with his easy smile and dangerous friends, the way he'd treated her like property he'd purchased rather than a person he'd chosen. She'd loved him once, before learning that love and survival rarely occupied the same space. The night she'd left, he'd been explaining remote detonators to his crew while she'd pretended to sleep in the next room, memorizing every detail in case that knowledge ever became the price of her freedom. That overheard conversation had saved a man's life 6 months later in a city Derek had never visited. The irony tasted bitter, like coffee grounds and regret. She'd spent half a year trying to forget everything about that life, but memory had turned out to be currency when it mattered most. Maya moved to her futon and sat on the edge, still wearing her work clothes, the black dress that represented her carefully constructed normal life. Sleep felt impossible, but staying awake felt worse, suspended between identities that no longer fit. The girl who'd loved Derek was dead. Maya, the waitress, would be dead by morning when she failed to show up for her shift. Who she'd be tomorrow remained an open question with no good answers. She lay back on the thin mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling, counting cracks instead of sheep, listening to the city's night sounds filter through windows that didn't seal properly against winter drafts. Morning came too early, gray light filtering through curtains that didn't quite close. Maya rolled over and reached for her phone with dread settling in her stomach. 9 missed calls from Aurelio's, 4 texts demanding she contact them immediately. But there was another number too, one she didn't recognize. The voicemail icon blinked at her like an accusation. She pressed play with her heart in her throat, expecting police or worse. Instead, a woman's voice filled the small room, professional and brisk. "Miss Maya Chen, this is Detective Sarah Morrison from the NYPD. We need you to come in and provide a statement regarding last night's incident at Aurelio's. Please call this number at your earliest convenience." Chen wasn't her real name either, just another borrowed identity from a friend of a friend, backed up with a social security number that wasn't quite fraud, but wasn't quite legal. Going to the police station meant questions she couldn't answer honestly. Not going meant looking guilty of something they'd eventually decide to investigate. She sat up and pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to think through exhaustion and fear. Neither option led anywhere good. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from the unknown number. Just an address in Tribeca and a time, 2 p.m. No name, no explanation, just coordinates and an appointment. She stared at the message, trying to decode its meaning, threat or invitation or something she hadn't considered. Another text followed seconds later. "You saved my life. I'd like to return the favor. Come alone." She didn't need a signature to know who'd sent it. The stranger from the corner table had somehow gotten her number, tracked down the identity she'd been hiding behind. The realization should have terrified her, but instead brought unexpected relief. Someone had seen her, really seen her, through all the careful invisibility. He understood what it meant that she'd told him to stay still before the police arrived, recognized the desperation of someone who couldn't afford official attention. That kind of seeing was dangerous, but it was also the first honest thing that had happened to her in 6 months. The address led to a building in Tribeca that whispered old money through its limestone façade and discreet entrance. No gaudy signage, no obvious security, just the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. Maya stood across the street at 1:55, watching people in expensive clothes flow in and out of polished doors. She'd changed 3 times before leaving her apartment, finally settling on jeans and a sweater that didn't look like she was trying too hard. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail, minimal makeup except what was necessary to hide the sleepless night. She looked like exactly what she was, someone trying to disappear while walking into a spotlight. The lobby opened to marble floors and art that was probably worth more than her annual salary. A receptionist looked up with professional courtesy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" The question carried weight, an assessment of whether Maya belonged in spaces like this. "I have an appointment at 2. She didn't offer a name, didn't know if she was expected or if this was elaborate revenge disguised as gratitude. The receptionist checked her computer screen and nodded once, surprise flickering across her features before training smoothed it away. 10th floor, suite 1001, the elevator is to your left." She gestured with manicured fingers, already returning to her screen. Maya had been categorized and dismissed, recognized as temporary rather than belonging. The elevator was the modern kind with mirrored walls that reflected her uncertainty back at infinite angles. She pressed the button for 10 and watched floors slide past through glass walls that revealed the building's interior courtyard. Her reflection looked like a stranger, pale and uncertain in a box designed to lift people far above her station. Suite 1001 had frosted glass doors with simple lettering, "Castellano Security Consultants." She didn't know what that meant. What kind of consulting required offices in Tribeca buildings? Her hand hesitated on the door handle. Last chance to turn around and disappear into the anonymity she'd worked so hard to maintain. She pushed through into a waiting room that was all leather chairs and abstract art that probably meant something to people who understood modern aesthetics. No receptionist here, just expensive silence and the smell of furniture polish that cost more than her monthly rent. A door opened on the far wall, and he stepped through. The stranger from the corner booth, looking somehow both familiar and impossible in daylight. He'd traded the charcoal suit for black slacks and a white shirt with sleeves rolled to his elbows, the casual elegance making him seem more human, less like the untouchable figure who'd sat surrounded by documents and danger. His dark eyes found hers with immediate recognition. "You came." He said it like he'd expected her to run, like her appearance here qualified as bravery rather than desperation. "I wasn't sure you would." He gestured toward the open door behind him, an invitation into private space that felt loaded with consequence. Maya crossed the waiting room on legs that remembered how to fake confidence. Years of pretending she belonged in places where she was invisible, teaching her to move with purpose, even when uncertainty threatened to paralyze her. The office beyond was smaller than she expected, lined with bookshelves and a window overlooking Tribeca's streets. A desk sat centered in the room, its surface clear except for a closed laptop and a phone turned face down. Two chairs faced the desk, positioned for conversation rather than interrogation. "Please, sit." He indicated the chairs with a gesture that acknowledged her wariness without mocking it. She sat on the edge of the leather, ready to bolt if the conversation turned wrong, if gratitude transformed into something darker. He remained standing, leaning against the bookshelf with studied casualness that somehow made him seem more dangerous rather than less. "The police want to talk to you," she said before he could start, establishing ground rules. "I can't go. I can't give statements or have my name in reports." The admission hung between them, confirming what he'd already guessed. She watched his face for judgment and found only careful consideration, the expression of someone processing information without rushing to conclusions. "I know." His voice was quiet, matter of fact. "I had my people look into Maya Chen. She doesn't exist beyond 6 months ago, which means someone's running from something." He didn't make it sound like accusation, just observation of facts he'd already accepted. "What's your real name?" She almost lied again, the instinct so ingrained it was practically involuntary. But he'd sat still on her word while death waited in the wings, trusted her with his life, based on nothing but a whisper from a stranger. That kind of faith deserved truth, even if it cost her everything she'd carefully built. Natalie. The name felt strange on her tongue after 6 months of not speaking it. "Natalie Reeves." He nodded slowly, testing the name against her face as if checking for fit. "Natalie." The way he said it was different from how he'd said Maya. No irony or shared deception, just her name spoken carefully, like something fragile. "I'm Dominic Castellano." The name landed with weight she recognized even without fully understanding its implications. Castellano. She'd heard Derek mention that name once or twice, always with the kind of respect criminals reserve for people more dangerous than themselves. "And you're right," Dominic continued, pushing off from the bookshelf and moving to the window. "You can't talk to the police. The device they found wasn't sophisticated, but the men who planted it were professionals. They'll investigate everyone who was in the building, looking for connections, witnesses, accomplices." He turned back from the window, his expression serious. "Your face will end up in databases. People who want to find you will have current photos, current location, confirmation that you're alive and in New York." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her chair, reality catching up to the decision she'd made in the moment. She'd saved his life, and in doing so had painted a target on her own back. Derek's crew would see her face in investigation reports, recognize her despite the fake name and dyed hair. Running had just become exponentially harder. "I can make you disappear properly." Dominic's words cut through her spiral of panic. "Not the half measure you've been managing with borrowed names and cash-only apartments. Real documentation, background that survives scrutiny, a life that doesn't require looking over your shoulder. He paused, letting the offer settle before delivering the condition she'd been expecting. But it comes with conditions. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Natalie felt her throat tighten, the phantom taste of too good to be true coating her tongue. Nothing came free in the world she'd escaped, especially not from men who wore expensive suits and had professionals planting devices designed to kill them. What kind of conditions? Her voice came out steadier than she felt, years of hiding fear behind composure serving her even now. Dominic moved back to the desk but didn't sit behind it, instead perching on its edge to maintain eye level with her, the gesture deliberate in its attempt to reduce the power imbalance between them. "You work for me." He said it simply, without dramatics. "I own several businesses in Manhattan, all of them legitimate. I need people who can think quickly under pressure, who notice details others miss. You proved you're capable of both." It sounded reasonable, almost boring in its normalcy, which meant it wasn't the whole truth, just the part he thought she could handle hearing. Natalie had learned to read men who dealt in partial truths, had spent enough time with Derek's crew to recognize when the real job existed in the spaces between words. "What do you really do?" She asked it directly, tired of dancing around obvious lies. People don't plant devices under legitimate businessmen, and security consultants don't have the resources to create identities that fool federal databases. She watched his face, cataloging the slight tightening around his eyes that meant she'd hit close to truth. Dominic studied her for a long moment, some internal calculation playing out behind dark eyes that revealed nothing until he decided to let them. "My family has interests that occasionally attract unwanted attention from competitors," he said carefully, each word selected for precision. "I manage those interests and protect the people involved. Everything we do operates within legal boundaries, but we exist in spaces where law and necessity sometimes have complicated relationships." Translation: organized crime dressed in legitimate business suits, the kind of operation that survived by keeping visible activities clean while hiding everything that mattered in shadows that even federal investigators struggled to penetrate. Natalie should have been horrified, should have stood up and walked out of the expensive office into the uncertain safety of her borrowed life. Instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her. She'd grown up around men who broke rules, loved one who'd crossed lines she'd pretended not to see. This was familiar territory, dangerous, but at least honestly dangerous. Better than waitressing for people who looked through her while she counted tips and prayed her past stayed buried in another city. What would I actually be doing? The question came out practical rather than afraid, acknowledgement that she was considering his offer despite, or perhaps because of, its implications. "Initially, administrative work at one of my restaurants," Dominic replied, his posture relaxing fractionally as he recognized her shift from resistance to negotiation. "You'd be visible, established, building a paper trail that makes Natalie Reeves real, but I'd also need you to do what you did last night: watch, listen, notice things that seem wrong." He leaned forward slightly, intensity returning to his expression. "You have instincts that most people never develop. The ability to see danger before it fully materializes. That's not a skill that can be taught, and it's valuable enough that protecting you serves my interests as much as yours." Natalie processed the offer, turning it over like a coin with unknown value on both sides. He was recruiting her into whatever shadow organization had earned someone's lethal attention. But he was also offering the first real safety she'd known since leaving Chicago, protection that came from power rather than hiding. "And if I say no?" She needed to know if refusal was actually an option or just an illusion of choice designed to make her feel like she had agency in a decision that had already been made for her. Then I give you 20,000 in cash and a phone number for someone who can create decent identification. Dominic said without hesitation, his tone carrying sincerity that surprised her. You'd have a head start before the police investigation makes running harder. No obligations, no strings attached. He held her gaze, letting her see the truth behind his words. You saved my life, Natalie. I don't repay that kind of debt by forcing you into corners. If you choose to walk away, you walk away clean with resources to start over somewhere else. The lack of coercion was almost harder to process than threats would have been. She'd expected ultimatums, the kind of trap disguised as choice that powerful men specialized in. Instead, he was offering genuine options, trusting her to make the decision that served her survival. It was disorienting, being treated like an equal by someone who clearly operated in different stratospheres of power. Why me? The question came out smaller than she intended. You probably have dozens of people who could do this work. People with training, backgrounds that aren't disasters. Why offer this to a waitress with a fake name and a criminal ex-boyfriend? Dominic's expression softened almost imperceptibly, something that might have been respect crossing his features. Because when death walked through that door last night, you didn't run. You walked toward it carrying an expensive wine bottle and a warning. He paused, making sure she heard what he was really saying. That kind of courage is rare, Natalie. I don't waste rare things. She thought about her apartment with its water-stained ceiling, the endless cycle of new cities and borrowed names. She thought about Derek, and the years she'd spent loving someone who'd treated her like property to be controlled, rather than a person to be cherished. She thought about the police wanting to put her face in databases where Derek could find her. If I do this, I need to know what happened last night, she said, her voice finding strength again, anchored by the decision forming in her chest. I need to know what I'm walking into. Who wants you dead enough to plant devices in public places? She met his eyes directly, refusing to accept sanitized corporate language when her life was the currency being negotiated. No polite fictions about competitors, just truth. Dominic nodded slowly, acknowledgement of her right to information that affected her survival. They work for the Vitale family, rivals who want control of logistics operations my family manages through the port. The attack was meant to look like random violence, eliminate me without starting a war that would draw federal attention. He paused, weighing his next words with visible care. They failed, which means they'll try again. Being near me comes with risks that don't disappear just because you're staff rather than family. If you accept this position, you accept that violence might find you through proximity to me. Natalie absorbed this. The reality of violence that wouldn't stop just because she'd disrupted one attempt. But violence had been chasing her anyway, different faces attached to the same fundamental danger. At least here, the threat came with resources to fight back, instead of just running faster toward the next temporary refuge. When would I start? The question emerged as acceptance, decision crystallizing into action. Tomorrow, if you want the job. Dominic straightened from the desk, extending his hand toward her. I'll have documentation ready within 48 hours. Until then, you'll stay in a corporate apartment I own in the financial district, somewhere secure while we handle the police investigation without your direct involvement. His hand hung in the air, between them, an offer and a bridge into unknown territory. Natalie stood and took his hand, feeling calluses that surprised her on someone who wore suits like armor. His grip was firm but not crushing, the handshake of someone who didn't need to prove strength through pressure. I want it, she said, and felt the words settle into truth as she spoke them. I want the job. Something flickered in his eyes. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction at a problem solved elegantly. Then welcome to Castellano Security Consultants, Miss Reeves. He released her hand but didn't step back, maintaining the close proximity that made the moment feel weighted with possibility. I'll have my driver take you to collect your things from your apartment. You won't be going back there. The finality of it should have scared her, this severing of the life she'd built from borrowed pieces. Instead, Natalie felt light, untethered in a way that promised either flight or falling. She'd jumped off enough cliffs to know the difference wouldn't be clear until she landed. What do I tell my landlord? Practical concerns emerging as shock began to recede. Nothing. Dominic moved toward the door, transitioning from intimate space back into business efficiency. I'll have someone handle the lease termination and forward any mail. The police will look for Maya Chen at that address and find she moved without notice. Dead ends are useful when you need them to be. The corporate apartment occupied the 20th floor of a glass tower in the financial district, all clean lines and furniture that looked like it belonged in magazines nobody actually read. Natalie stood in the center of the living room while Dominic's driver deposited her 2 duffel bags by the door, everything she owned fitting into spaces meant for weekend trips. There's food in the kitchen, Dominic said, gesturing toward the open-plan space where stainless steel appliances gleamed under recessed lighting. Basics to get you through a few days. The building has 24-hour security. Your name is on the approved list, but no one else gets up without calling first. Natalie nodded, still processing the transition from her 5th-floor walk-up to this vertical fortress. The windows offered views of the financial district's canyon of glass and steel, the city spreading below like a circuit board of light and commerce. She'd spent 6 months looking at brick walls and fire escapes, geography that reminded her to stay small. There's a phone on the counter, programmed with my direct number. He moved toward the door, giving her space to breathe, to process what she'd agreed to. Use it if you need anything, or if something feels wrong. Trust your instincts, Natalie. They've kept you alive this long. She watched him prepare to leave. This stranger who'd upended her careful invisibility in less than 24 hours. Dominic? His name felt strange on her tongue, too familiar and not familiar enough. He paused in the doorway, turning back with expression open to whatever she needed to say. Why are you really doing this? She needed to understand the motivation beyond debt repayment. The obligation doesn't require penthouses and new identities. You could have just given me money and let me disappear. He considered her question with the same careful attention he'd given everything else, choosing words that would carry truth rather than comfort. Because I've spent 10 years building walls between myself and everyone else. Last night you walked through all of them without hesitation. His expression shifted into something almost vulnerable, a crack in the armor revealing the person beneath the power. That kind of fearlessness deserves protection, not exploitation. And maybe... He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. Maybe I'm tired of those walls. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Natalie alone in borrowed luxury. She moved to the window and looked down at the street 20 floors below, watching cars and people move in patterns that didn't include her, that never had included her, except as invisible service worker or victim in waiting. For the first time in years, she felt the dangerous stirring of hope taking root in her chest, the possibility that maybe this time the landing would be flight rather than falling. 3 days passed in strange suspension, Natalie existing in the apartment like a ghost haunting someone else's life. Dominic called twice daily, brief check-ins that felt more personal than professional. She learned he took his coffee black and hated mornings, that he'd built his empire from ruins his father left behind, that the walls he'd mentioned weren't just metaphor, but survival strategy learned young. The documentation arrived on the 4th day, delivered by a courier who handed over a manila envelope without comment. Inside, Natalie found a driver's license, social security card, and birth certificate, all bearing her real name, backed by fabricated history that looked seamless. Natalie Reeves had been born in Boston, attended state college, worked retail jobs that left paper trails through tax records. The life he'd built for her was ordinary enough to be invisible, remarkable only in how thoroughly unremarkable it appeared. Her first day of work arrived with sunrise painting the financial district gold and pink. She dressed in clothes that had been delivered the previous evening, business casual that fit perfectly despite no measurements being taken. The attention to detail felt both comforting and slightly invasive, evidence of resources she couldn't begin to measure. The restaurant was called Meridian, positioned in Midtown with views of office towers and the constant flow of people who made Manhattan's economy pulse. Natalie arrived at 9 to find Dominic waiting in the manager's office, looking exhausted in a way that suggested he hadn't slept. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his suit, If, remained impeccable. Armor against whatever had kept him awake. "The Vitale family knows about you." He said it without preamble, delivering bad news like ripping off bandages. "They have photos from Aurelio's security footage, your face clear enough for identification." He paused, making sure she understood. "I wanted you to know before you decided whether to stay." Natalie felt ice water replace blood in her veins, but her expression remained steady, years of hiding fear presenting as calm. "How much danger am I in?" She needed facts, not comfort. "Do they know who I am?" "They know you warned me, which makes you either competition or a problem that needs solving." Dominic's honesty felt brutal and necessary, respect disguised as harsh reality. "We've increased security protocols across all properties. You'll have a driver who's trained in protection, and this building has been cleared of potential vulnerabilities." She should walk away, take the 20,000 he'd offered and disappear into another borrowed identity. But Natalie was tired of running, exhausted by the endless cycle of new names and temporary addresses. Sometimes survival meant standing ground instead of seeking new territory to abandon when danger inevitably followed. "I'm staying." The words came out stronger than she felt. Commitment made before fear could talk her out of it. Dominic's relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders in incremental release. "Then we do this carefully. You work front of house here, visible and legitimate. The Vitales watch my businesses, so we use that. Let them see you're just staff, nothing worth the attention that killing you would bring." The work was surprisingly normal. Natalie training under a manager who treated her like any new hire, learning table numbers and kitchen timing. She memorized wine lists and plate presentations, her body remembering the rhythm of restaurant service that had become second nature over the years. But now she also cataloged faces, noting who lingered too long or asked questions that felt wrong. And Dominic appeared during lunch service on her third day, sitting at a table near the kitchen where he could watch the dining room without being obvious. Natalie felt his presence like static electricity, awareness that prickled along her spine whenever they occupied the same space. She brought him water without being asked, a gesture that felt both professional and intimate. "Table 7 has been nursing the same drink for 40 minutes, she said quietly while refilling his glass. "He's watching the private dining area more than his phone." The observation came naturally. Instincts she'd developed for survival now employed for purposes she was still learning to understand. Dominic's eyes flicked toward table 7, cataloging the man with professional assessment. "Good catch. That's surveillance. Probably Vitale." He said it calmly, like discussing weather instead of enemies watching from inside his own. "Restaurant. Let him watch. We have nothing to hide today." But something in his tone suggested other days might be different, that legitimate business was only part of the operation. Natalie felt the weight of secrets she hadn't been told, information deliberately withheld until she proved trustworthy enough to handle deeper truths. Weeks accumulated into strange new normal. Natalie settling into routines that included morning check-ins with Dominic and evening reviews of anything unusual she'd observed. They developed shorthand communication that required fewer words as understanding deepened. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, the way exhaustion manifested as unusual stillness rather than visible fatigue. He learned she took her coffee with excessive sugar and hated being startled. Small preferences she'd never shared with anyone who bothered remembering. The attention felt foreign, being known by someone who didn't require her to perform constant gratitude for basic consideration. The black SUV appeared on a Tuesday morning, parked across from her building with tinted windows that reflected dawn light. Natalie noticed it from her 20th floor window while drinking her too-sweet coffee, the vehicle's presence wrong in a way that triggered every alarm her instincts possessed. She called Dominic before her conscious mind finished identifying the threat. "There's a car watching the building." Her voice stayed level despite her pulse hammering in her throat. "Black SUV, no plates visible from this angle. Been there since at least 6. She heard him moving on the other end of the line, the rustle of clothing suggesting she'd woken him despite the early hour. "Stay inside, away from windows." His voice had shed all warmth, pure command sharpened by concern. "I'm sending a team to sweep the vehicle. Don't leave the apartment until I call you back." 20 minutes crawled past before 2 men in maintenance uniforms approached the SUV, their movements too coordinated to be random building staff. They circled the vehicle twice before one produced tools that had nothing to do with legitimate repair work. Her phone rang. "It's clean, no explosives," Dominic said, simultaneously relieved and frustrated. "Just surveillance, but the message is clear. They want you to know they can reach you whenever they decide to." "I need to disappear again." Natalie said it even though the words tasted like defeat. "They'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt." "No." The word came swift and absolute. "You disappearing is what they want. Proof that intimidation works." His conviction resonated through the phone. "Pack a bag. You're moving somewhere they can't watch so easily." The somewhere turned out to be his house, a brownstone in the West Village where old money whispered through brick facades and tree-lined streets. Natalie stood in the foyer feeling displaced, her duffel bag insignificant against the backdrop of inherited wealth. "This is too much. I can stay in a hotel." "Hotels have registries that can be accessed." Dominic took her bag like the discussion was already settled. "This house has security that predates modern surveillance. You'll be safe here while we handle the Vitale problem permanently." The guest room was larger than her entire previous apartment, decorated in blues and grays that felt masculine without being aggressive. Natalie set her bag on the bed and moved to windows that overlooked a garden where something still bloomed despite approaching winter. "How long has it been since someone else stayed here?" The question emerged before she could consider its implications. "Years." Dominic appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with studied casualness. "I don't invite people into personal spaces often. Habit from growing up where privacy was the only luxury money couldn't always buy." The admission felt significant, a glimpse behind carefully maintained walls. The resolution came not through violence, but through leverage Natalie herself provided. 3 days after moving into Dominic's house, she remembered something Derek had mentioned during one of his late-night bragging sessions. The Vitale family laundered money through a construction company in Jersey using falsified inspection reports that Derek's crew had helped create. She told Dominic over breakfast, the information spilling out between bites of toast she couldn't taste. He listened with absolute focus, his coffee growing cold as she detailed everything she could recall. Within hours, his people had confirmed the operation, gathered evidence that could bring federal attention the Vitale family couldn't afford. The negotiation happened in neutral territory, a lawyer's office where both families sat across polished tables with decades of animosity temporarily set aside. Dominic presented the evidence without theatrics, simple facts that carried the weight of potential destruction. The Vitale representative, an older man with calculating eyes, studied the documents with visible resignation. You're offering a trade. It wasn't a question, just acknowledgement of terms both sides understood. Our withdrawal from your logistics operations in exchange for your silence on our construction business, the man said, measuring losses against catastrophic exposure. And the girl is under your protection permanently. Any action against her is action against my family directly, Dominic stated with finality that left no room for negotiation. The documentation I have goes to federal authorities within hours of any incident. We both walk away from this. That's the offer. Papers were signed with witnesses present, agreements that carried the weight of mutual assured destruction. The war ended not with violence, but with signatures, danger diffused by information Natalie had carried without knowing its value. They drove home in silence that felt different from tense waiting. Dominic's hands relaxed on the wheel. Natalie watched Manhattan slide past her window, the city transformed from hostile territory into something that might actually become home. It's really over. She needed confirmation, permission to believe safety might last longer than borrowed moments. It's over. Dominic pulled up to his house, the brownstone appearing between trees still clinging to autumn leaves. The Vitalis honor their agreements when the alternative is worse. You're safe now, Natalie. Actually safe, not just hiding better. He parked and turned to face her, something vulnerable in his expression. Which means you don't have to stay here anymore if you don't want to. You have real documentation now. Resources. A legitimate job. You could build a life separate from all this. The offer hung between them. Freedom disguised as courtesy. She could take her new identity and start over. Create something that didn't involve danger or complicated men with walls built from necessity. What if I want to stay? The question came out softer than intended, admission of feelings that had grown in quiet moments between crisis and coffee. Not because I need protection or owe you debts, but because coming home to this house with you in it feels different than any place I've ever lived. Dominic's expression shifted into something that looked like relief wrapped in wonder. Then stay. Not as an employee or someone I'm protecting. He reached across and took her hand with familiar care. Stay as someone who belongs here with me, building something neither of us planned but both of us want. Natalie squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, evidence of parallel struggles that had somehow intersected in a restaurant where death had waited. I'll stay, but I'm keeping the job at Meridian. I like the work, and I'm good at noticing things. I'm counting on it. He smiled, the expression transforming his face into something younger, less burdened by inherited weight. 6 months later, Natalie stood in Meridian's dining room during lunch service, coordinating orders with efficiency that made the chef nod approval. She wore her real name on her name tag now, Natalie Reeves printed in letters that belonged to her completely. Dominic appeared during dessert service, taking his usual table where he could watch her work. She brought him coffee without asking, the gesture now habit built from countless repetitions. Quiet day, she said, setting down the cup. Nothing unusual to report except Table 12 asked if we cater private events. He looked up at her with amusement playing around his mouth. Maybe we should start. His eyes held something that looked like hope mixed with certainty. I hear there's demand for it. She touched his shoulder briefly before returning to work, the gesture small but deliberate. Behind her, she heard him laugh quietly, the sound carrying through dining noise like a promise kept. They'd both been running from different things before a device and a warning brought them to the same moment. Now they were building something that didn't require either of them to disappear, a life constructed from honest names and shared mornings, and the kind of safety that came from being truly known. The debt had been repaid in full, replaced by something that felt remarkably like home. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.